Hello everyone, this is our group's final video presentation and I'm in charge of question 1, so buckle up and let's get started. Okay. If you need to read through the description of the question, feel free to pause the video, but I'll just dive into the questions now. The first question asks what is federal funds rate and why it has been kept at a very high level in the US. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate at which depository institutions such as banks and credit unions lend reserve balances to other depository institutions overnight on an uncollateralized basis. This rate is set by the Federal Reserve and is a crucial tool for implementing monetary policy. As a monetary policy tool, it is used by the Federal Reserve to influence overall economic activity, including inflation, employment, and the stability of the financial system. Changes in the federal funds rate can also influence other interest rates, including those for mortgages, loans, and savings, which affect consumer and business spending. And as an economic signal, a higher rate suggests that the Fed is concerned about inflation, while a lower rate indicates that the Fed is trying to stimulate economic growth. As for the case in the US, uh, it has experienced high inflation since 2023. To combat this, the Fed has increased and maintained a high federal funds rate, and by doing so, it increases borrowing costs, which slows down consumer spending and business investment. A higher rate makes it more profitable to keep money in the bank and increase the cost of borrowing for businesses. This reduces demand-driven inflation. Additionally, keeping the interest rates high attracts capital inflows to the US, leading to an appreciation of the dollar. A stronger dollar makes US exports more expensive and imports cheaper, impacting the trade balance and contributing further to controlling inflation. So, next question. The discount rate is uh, is the interest rate on the loans that the Central Bank of Taiwan (CBT) makes to commercial banks. It is a tool used by the CBT to influence the money supply and overall economic activity. And an increase in the discount rate discourages commercial banks from borrowing funds from the central bank. And when banks borrow less, they have fewer reserves to lend out, which reduces the overall money supply in the economy. And as we have discussed it this semester, the primary cause of inflation is the growth in the quantity of money. Therefore, by reducing the money supply in the economy, inflation can also be decreased. Moving on to the third question, the what is real interest rate and so on. The real interest rate is the rate at which a person can trade the goods and services of one country for the goods and services for another. The real interest rate also compares the prices of domestic goods and foreign goods in the domestic economy. And according to the graph, capital inflows into the US increases due to high domestic interest rates. This reduces net capital outflow, NCO, which in turn reduces the supply of dollars being exchanged into foreign currency. And as a result, the reduced supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market causes the real exchange rate to appreciate. Moving on to the fourth question. it asks what is the nominal exchange rate and to draw a diagram for Tokyo's foreign currency exchange market. So the nominal exchange rate is the rate at which a person can trade the currency of one country for the currency of another. The nominal exchange rate can be expressed in two ways. In units of foreign currency per $1 or in units of US dollars per 1 unit of foreign currency. But it is also common to use it in units of foreign currency per domestic currency. Okay. And as for the graph, this is the original state of the Tokyo's foreign currency exchange market. And since it is Tokyo's foreign currency exchange market, we will have foreign currency per domestic currency. So the US dollar per Japanese yen on the vertical axis and the quantity of domestic currency and Japanese yen on the horizontal axis. We can find the nominal exchange rate at E1. Okay, moving on. That's a long question. I'm not going to read all that out, but yeah, I'll just dive into the answer. An increase in capital outflows from Japan causes the demand for yen in the foreign exchange market to decrease. And when capital flows out of Japan, investors and businesses convert their yen into US dollars to invest or spend in the US. This reduces the demand for yen in the foreign exchange market, leading to a depreciation of the yen while the US dollar appreciates. The Central Bank of Japan counteracts this by decreasing the supply of the Japanese yen, shifting the supply curve from S2 to S1, and this causes the Japanese yen to appreciate in respect to the US dollar, and so returns the exchange rate back to E3. That would be 155 Japanese yen per US dollar. And yes. Okay, thank you.
This is question 2, presented by me. Student ID 112ZU1033. So the premise for question 2 is that China has experienced a fast economic growth since it opened the door to the world. The real estate has contributed to China's GDP significantly. However, since 2019, China's economy has suffered from threats of several black swans. First, the trade war between the US and China. Second, foreign companies have continued to leave China since the COVID-19 pandemic. And third, China has been experiencing a real estate crisis with the collapse of giants like Evergrande and Country Garden. And lastly, China's stock market has hit new 5-year lows. So then, what are the effects of these? So first, the trade war between the US and China would decrease China's net exports, as China would export less to the US due to the increased price for Americans. And this decrease in net export would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, which would mean a decrease in output at the same price level. The effect of the leaving of foreign companies would be foreign direct investment leaving China, and this could also lead to pessimism in the economy that could further decrease investment but also consumption. If the foreign companies leaving China causes a significant job loss, then consumption would also decrease more, and thus the aggregate demand would shift to the left. The real estate crisis, though the lowering of prices in real estate would, one would imagine, would cause consumers to feel more wealthy, it would actually have the opposite effect in China, because many Chinese people have invested a lot of their wealth into property, and the decrease in property prices will cause consumers to lose wealth and therefore spend less at any point. investment in real estate market would also stop, and the pessimism caused by the crash would further decrease both consumption and investment, shifting aggregate demand further to the left. The stock market crash would also lead to a decrease in consumption and shift aggregate demand to the left. So here we have models to show this, to show the impacts of the black swan events on China's real GDP and overall price in the short run. So here you can see the short run, the original short run aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. So you can see the equilibrium of the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is at the long run aggregate supply, or at the natural rate of output. Then the shift of the aggregate demand to the left, caused by all the factors mentioned earlier, will shift the aggregate short run aggregate demand to the left, lowering prices but also output. After a while, the short run aggregate supply will shift to the right as a consequence of this. And this would allow output to return to its natural rate, but price levels would be further decreased. So what do we suggest that China's government should do in response to the short-run economic fluctuations? The Chinese government should attempt to increase aggregate demand to stabilize it. And this would be done best by increasing the money supply through increasing government spending. It would also be positive for the government to increase taxes on the very wealthy and get rid of the regressive value-added tax. This is because money in the hands of the middle and working class people is spent on it's more likely to be spent on consumption or investment domestically, increasing the aggregate demand, while money kept by the top percents is significantly more likely to be spent on consumption and investment abroad or hoarding in offshore bank accounts. And we also think that the Central Bank of China should also attempt to increase the aggregate demand, which it would do by increasing money supply and reducing the interest rate. And this should possibly easiestly be done through open market operations such as purchasing government bonds.
Hi, this is Han Wen-Yi Yun Chen. Next, I'm going to introduce our problem 3. And let's go. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the European Union adopted a number of sanctions in an attempt to immobilize the war effort. One sanction was a complete import ban on all Russia's burning crude oil and petroleum products. This sanction sent energy price to history high. And first one, in the energy market, the supply and demand model can explain why the sanction on Russian oil lead to a sharp increase in energy prices. The sanction on Russian oil significantly reduces the supply of oil in the EU market, so the supply will shift to left and make the price higher. Second one, how could this sanction affect overall price in the EU in the short run, output and employment? First, it will cause a inflation by higher energy prices, and it is cost-push inflation. Increased energy price lead to higher production costs for businesses, which can result in higher prices for goods and services across the economies. This type of inflation occurs when rising costs and inputs push out the overall price level, and it will cause decreased output, and it will cause a decreased output and increased unemployment. Higher production costs can lead to reduced output as business struggle to maintain profit margins. Redu- and reduced output may cause firms to cut back on labor, leading to higher unemployment. So third, if EU authority would like to solve the inflation problem, what kind of fiscal policy is appropriate for EU authority to implement? To address inflation, the EU authority should implement contractionary fiscal policy. First is reduce government spending. Second is increase taxes by reducing aggregate demand. And these mentions can help bring down the overall price level. Fourth, if EU authorities would like to solve the recession problem, what kind of monetary problem is appropriate for the EU authority to implement? And to address recessions, the EU authority should implement expansionary monetary policy. First is lower interest rate, and second is quantitative easing. These actions can increase aggregate demand, boosting economic output and reducing unemployment. Okay, so B. Could EU authority use a single policy to simultaneously solve both inflation and recession problem? My answer is no. It is challenging to using a single policy to simultaneously solve both inflation and recession due to their complete nature. You can take a look on this. So this graph means represent a relationship for inflation or in and recession. So you can see you can see it. This graph calls Philip curves plus the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So while a single straightforward policy may not simultaneously solve both inflation and recession due to their completing nature and carefully balanced mix of supply side and demand side interventions can effectively address both issues. Thus, and in graphically, this involves this involves this involves shifting both the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves to achieve a new equilibrium with lower inflation and higher output. This nonce approach requires coordinated fiscal and monetary policy aimed at enhancing productivity while stimulating demand in a targeted manner. Thank you.
Okay, so for my part, it's the fourth question, and it said in the past decade, the quantitative easing policy was often used by the major economies such as USA, Japan, and EU to deal with its recession problem. These economies could no longer use conventional monetary policy to lower their short-term interest rate due to the liquidity trap in the money market. Therefore, they choose to use the quantitative easing policy to lower the long-term interest rate. The main goal was to stimulate the economy by increasing aggregate demand. Okay, so for the first little question is use a graph of money market to explain why an increase in money supply cannot lower short-term interest rate, suggesting the existence of liquidity trap. Okay, so this is my graph.
And we can see that um, if we increase the money supply, the economy is in a liquidity trap, and the interest rate is already extremely low, and people and businesses are more likely to hoard cash rather than spending or investing it. This means that the money demand curve is almost flat, indicating that changes in the interest rate have little effect on the quantity of money demand. Okay, so for the second question, what is quantitative easing policy? What is the difference between quantitative easing policy and conventional monetary policy? So, for the quantitative easing policy, the central bank purchases securities to reduce interest rates and increase the money supply. But for the conventional money policy, it's only changing a target for a short-term interest rate. Okay, so for the third one, please introduce the quantitative easing policies adopted by USA between 2008 and 2014. So, in 2008, it happened the financial crisis, which reducing the federal funds rate, and they used the quantitative easing policy to mitigate an economic recession. And in 2014, the effort of the quantitative easing policy is widely credited for accelerating recovery and boosting economic growth. The main concern of quantitative easing policy is that increasing the money demand in a large scale will induce inflation. Okay, let's get into the fourth question. Explain why the quantitative easing policy could increase aggregate demand. So for the fourth question, quantitative easing policy is to increase the money supply, just like I mentioned, and reduce interest rate by the central bank purchases securities. So people are willing to purchase, so we can know the consumption will rise, and also government spending will increase. So the aggregate demand will increase also. So for the fifth one, it's asking for use appropriate models to show how the quantitative easing policy would shift the aggregate demand curve and influence output and overall price of economy. Graphical and descriptive analysis are required. So let's look at this. This is a diagram, and we can see that the aggregate demand is rises. So the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right due to the rise of consumption and the government spending. And so we can see that the equilibrium of price and output, which is mean the real GDP, is moved from A to B, which is we have an appreciate of price level, and we increase the output. So both price level and output appreciate.
Hello everyone, this is Susan Davalos. My student ID is 112ZU1041. I hope you all are having a nice day. Right now it's pouring outside. I hope my laptop doesn't record the thunders in the back. Well, here we are now in the last exercise for this homework, and it goes as follows. Donald John Trump became the 45th president in USA in 2016. His economic policies were called Trumponomics. There were two main arrows of Trumponomics: tax cut and protectionism with high tariff. And first, President Trump lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% in order to encourage domestic investment. Second, he imposed a high tariff on imported goods, mainly from China. And when Joe Biden became the 46th president in USA in 2020, he did not follow Trump's tax cut policy. Alternatively, he called for tax increase on corporations and the wealthy people. So the first question for this last exercise is: in the United States, the Republican Party follows the principle of supply side economics, or so called Reagan economics, whereas the Democrat Party follows the principle of demand side economics, or so called Keynesian economics. Explain the difference between supply side economics and demand side economics. So I put the difference, like the comparison, in this table. The supply side economics focus on this on on suppliers of factors of production, which are like the firms and households, as and the demand side of economics focus more like in tax increase for the wealthiest and social welfare, like subsidizing the poor. And here we can see the difference a little bit closer. We have that the supply side of economics aims to increase production and supply uh, using tax cuts, deregulation, investment incentives. It's the economic growth is in long term through enhanced production and capacity, and job creations are made through private investment and business expansion. Government role is minimal, reducing regulation and interference. Potential risk: income inequality, as the rich tend to get richer, and while the poor tend to get poorer, and delayed benefits. And on the demand side, economics increasing consumption and demand, affecting directly to the aggregate demand for goods and services. Primary tools: government spending, like I just said. Uh, if the government spends more, then that spending influence the aggregate demand right away. And progressive taxation. Short term through in the economic growth is in the short term through immediate increase in demand, and job creations are made through increased demand in government programs. The government role here is way more active through spending and intervention, and potential risks are like inflation and increased government debt. For the next question, by following question one, explain why President Trump implemented tax cut policies while President Biden implemented tax increase policies. Well, Trump's approach aligns with the supply side economics. How so? Arthur Laffer was one of Trump's advisors during the campaign in 2016. He encouraged the candidate to propose a large tax cut because by reducing, according to him, corporative taxes from 35% to 21%, he believed tax revenue would actually increase. The lower taxes will encourage domestic investment and people will have more incentive to work, increasing the quantity of labor supplied. These policies align with Republican principles of reducing government intervention and promoting private sector driven growth. And on the other hand, Biden's approach aligns with the demand side economics. How so? Well, as we know, traditional Keynesian analysis indicates that increases in government purchases are a more potent tool than decreases in taxes. When households get extra disposable income from a tax cut, they will likely save some of that additional income rather than spend it all, especially if households view the reduction as temporary rather than permanent. The fraction of the extra income saved does not contribute to the aggregate demand for goods and services. By contrast, when the government spends a dollar buying a good or service, that dollar immediately and fully adds to aggregate demand. Biden then, by increasing taxes on corporations and the wealthy, aimed to reduce income inequality and provide more resources for public spending. These policies reflect the Democrats' principles of active government intervention to manage the economy and support broader social welfare. And then for the next question, we have, um, as mentioned, the corporate tax rate was reduced to encourage domestic investment. How can this Trump's policy influence the market for loan-level fund in USA? What happens to real interest rate, net capital outflow, real exchange rate, and trade balance? In USA, graphical analysis is required. Okay, so we know that in the demand curve of of low level funds, we have domestic investment. So if we have encouraged domestic investment, that means we have more domestic investment. So there's a shift of the demand curve, a shift to the right. While the demand curve shifts to the right, the interest rate then goes higher. This interest rate that goes higher, we can see it reflected in the net capital outflow. And while we see it reflected in the net capital outflow, which is that the net capital outflow falls, then this fall in the net capital outflow reduces the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market. And then the real exchange rate appreciates, which is the dollars become more expensive, and this eventually lead to a reduction in net exports. And for the fourth question, we have a high tariff was levied on import goods to reduce trade deficit of USA. How can this Trump's tariff policy influence the market for foreign currency exchange? What happens to real exchange rate and the trade balance? Graphical analysis is required. Well, a trade restriction such as tariff or quotas on imports, it's believed to increase net exports for any given exchange rate. Because we have like net exports is exports minus imports. We reduce the imports because like now that we have tariff on imports, it's more expensive for Americans to buy these products. So now we have less imports, and therefore we will have more net exports. And this will lead us to more dollars being demanded to buy this net exports. Now there is a higher number, right? And this actually it's pretty connected to the next exercise. Oh well, we lastly we can see that the exchange rate increases, which is that the dollar appreciates, the dollar become more expensive. And let's go to the fifth question that is connected to this one, which is many economists oppose Trump's tariff policy. They think that Trump's tariff policy could not solve the trade imbalance problem with China. Explain why economists think that way. Well, although restrictive trade policies such as tariff quotas on imports are sometimes advocated as a way to alter the trade balance, they do not necessarily have that effect because the increased demand for dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange, like we just saw, causes the dollar to appreciate, making domestic goods more expensive relative to foreign goods. This appreciation offsets the initial impact of the trade restriction on net exports. So actually, like a better solution might be fostering international cooperation to create a more balanced and fair trade environment instead of those restrictive trade policies. And well, that is the last question for this exercise. Thank you everyone for listening. Have a nice day. Bye bye.